Hello everybody, I'm John Schneider, your host for Jersey Bayshore Country, and this is part 2 of our 6-part series on the story or history of Sandy Hook, New Jersey. You know, every year lots of people cross the bridge over the Shrewsbury River to Sandy Hook, New Jersey, where there are plenty of beautiful beaches. About 7 miles of beaches along the Atlantic Ocean and the Raritan Bay, in fact. And basically, that's all some people know about the Hook, that the beaches are a great place to visit and play. A few more people have visited and maybe even climbed the historic lighthouse at Sandy Hook, built in 1764. I think a lot of people know there was a military base on Sandy Hook. That's sort of obvious. And some other folks see some of the big guns aimed out toward the ocean. There are 2 of them that still stand. And even fewer see the crumbled remains of concrete artillery bunkers. But hardly anyone completely understands the enormity of work done by the Sandy Hook Proving Grounds. It's an amazing story all by itself. So we start with the Civil War, which was a period when all kinds of innovations in new weaponry was taking place. Bullet-nosed projectiles were being developed, which could fly a lot farther and a lot faster than those cannonballs. Ironclad warships with mounted guns could destroy the walls of a traditional fort. Following the Civil War, the United States found itself at a crossroads. The war had been costly, but it had certainly provided valuable lessons on fortifications and weapons. It was also a period when the military realized that the guns and fortifications used during the Civil War were fast becoming obsolete. As a result, the country focused a little more on developing new weaponry and fortifications which could better defend the nation from an advancing enemy, presumably from Europe. Because steam now powered many of the navies of these foreign countries, the United States began feeling a little more vulnerable to attack than ever before. The Corps of Engineers had begun experimenting with different types of armor plating to cover existing forts, which were made of masonry or stone.
We stopped work on the masonry fort in 1870. Essentially, Congress said, we have a problem with masonry forts. We've just gone through the Civil War and we realize they have a problem. Modern weapons are defeating them. The United States was on the cusp in the 1870s of being the world's premier steelmaker. And we had a number of large companies that were gearing up. One of them was Bethlehem Steel out in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And these large companies, along with many inventors and scientists, were developing new and better ways to improve the quality of what then was known as iron. But for the Army, it was about, can I make a gun that's strong enough to withhold the detonation in the powder chamber to project a shell at a reasonably high rate of speed in order to penetrate a target? And can I make an armor-piercing shell that's hard enough to poke through an armor plate without crumbling and being defeated by the armor plate? And can I make an armor plate that's strong enough to crumble or defeat the armor-piercing shell? So you had a lot of businesses, a lot of scientists, a lot of engineers, all competing against each other to develop the best.
Meanwhile, the Ordnance Department of the United States Army was designing larger and more powerful guns, which of course had to be tested.
When weapons are being developed, they're in the hands of the Ordnance Department. And these are specialized troops that are looking at a weapon to go, how do I make this work better? And they're working with scientists and engineers to improve them.
By 1872, President Ulysses Grant approved funding for the experimentation and testing of, quote, heavy rifled ordnance. We need to say a few words about the difference in a smoothbore gun versus a rifled gun. It was a major technological change in the way the barrel of the gun was manufactured. Prior to this time, most gun barrels were smoothbore. In other words, if you looked inside the barrel, it would appear to be smooth. Since the 1700s, armies had been using rifled muskets. These small arms had rifling or spiral twists in the bore, normally 1 turn in 20 inches. This rifling imparted a spin on the projectile that greatly increased both the accuracy and the range of shoulder-fired weapons. Interestingly, what the United States was proposing to do was already being done in some of the European countries. Everyone was a bit behind the curve. So also in 1872, the Chief of Ordnance advised the Secretary of War that he wanted to find a place for a proving and experimental ground, as he described it. Some testing was being done near Fort Monroe, Virginia, as part of the artillery school there, but the space was simply too limited for the kind of testing that was now required. The Ordnance Corps needed a test range of at least 6 miles with level ground and close to railroad lines. And it had to be on land that was currently owned or very inexpensive to purchase. Land purchases by the government have required congressional approval since our founding, and getting Congress to agree was the toughest part. Several potential sites for the proving ground were considered within New Jersey as well as Long Island. Most of the sites, however, just had too many people moving into the area or cost too much to purchase. The upper end of Squaw Beach near Point Pleasant, New Jersey seemed pretty good, so it was surveyed and a proposal was made to Congress that it be purchased. Congress turned the Army down. The Army did own a reservation on Sandy Hook, which was about 18 miles from New York City as the crow flies. And outside the construction of a masonry fort that was suspended in 1870, there was no Army activity on Sandy Hook. Congress suggested to the Secretary of War that he consider using Sandy Hook. So, in coordination with the Corps of Engineers, Sandy Hook could be utilized as a temporary testing facility while Congress decided whether to allow the Secretary of the Army to purchase more land, such as at Squaw Beach. In 1874, the Army's Ordnance Department established a temporary proving ground at Sandy Hook, New Jersey. So, on October 24th, 1874, the very first test was undertaken to fire a 10-inch Rodman smoothbore gun, which had been converted to an 8-inch rifled gun. You may have heard explosions on a daily basis coming from across the Shrewsbury River from the direction of Sandy Hook. And what folks were hearing was the sound of highly secretive work being performed. Oh yeah, it was the United States Ordnance Department testing new and experimental weapons, military weapons. And while it was originally a temporary location in which to test weapons, the proving ground stayed at Sandy Hook from 1874 until 1919, when it moved to Aberdeen, Maryland, where it's located today as the nation's proving ground. But first, let's get oriented in terms of where exactly it was located and what remains of it today, and then we'll get into the history. So for those of you who need to start with the big picture, I know I always do, you're going to recognize this place, America the Beautiful, all right? Now, we're going over to the East Coast. We're going right here. Here's a close-up on the left. It's northern New Jersey and Raritan Bay, where all the ships enter to get into New York Harbor. Now, let's take an even closer look. Here we go. On the left, Sandy Hook and Raritan Bay, and on the right, a close-up of Sandy Hook, which is a peninsula, or technically a spit. Now, stay with me because I'm turning the photo on the right about 90 degrees, like this. And here's where we're going to focus our program. Okay, one more photograph, which was once considered to be highly classified by the government. Take a moment to get oriented. You know, what's crazy about Sandy Hook is how the shape has changed from year to year, and mostly from decade to decade. So the shape of the hook in these two photographs, which are at least 50 years apart from each other, are very different. The shape is different, see it? So let's zoom into the black and white photo. So here we are, and before we start digging into the history of the Sandy Hook Proving Ground, let me give you a quick look around. First, here's the lighthouse. It's been here for a very long time, and it predates everything we're going to talk about in this episode. We talked about the lighthouse in the last episode. And here is the Coast Guard in a restricted area, big fence around it. Now, all of the orange-colored frames are simply provided to give you a sense of the area we're looking at. None of these areas are a perfect rectangle, so take my designations with a grain of salt. So again, this is the Coast Guard, and some of the relics and ruins associated with the history of the Proving Ground are inside this area, so we're going to have to peek through the fence. And here's the Army post, Fort Hancock, which is a huge story, and we're going to take a look at it more closely in one of our future episodes within this series. And another note about the fort, it eventually took over all of the area occupied by the proving ground when it went to Aberdeen, and so many of the buildings were repurposed for the fort. But we're not going to discuss the fort very much in this episode, okay? We're going to keep focused on the Sandy Hook Proving Ground, so onward. And this is mostly where the Sandy Hook Proving Ground was located. And this is the area we're going to visit in more detail. Originally, all of the testing of weapons were done close to where the Coast Guard is located today, right here. And they would fire projectiles from the weapons toward the south, toward the town of Seabright, as well as into the Atlantic Ocean. Now don't worry, the range of these early weapons was much shorter than it is today, and so Seabright was not in jeopardy. And here's a photo of the original test area, or proof battery, and I'm gonna call it a couple of different things. If you watch the first episode in our series, you'll recognize the Gray Lady, the old fort which never got completed because it became obsolete after the Civil War. So it was a perfect location for the Army. Later, most of the fort was removed, but you can still see a remnant of it on the Coast Guard property. So we're facing west, and off in the distance on the horizon is Sandy Hook Bay, and you can just about make out the hills of Highlands if you look closely. Below are some gun carriages in which the guns would be placed. And do you see the railroad tracks running along there? They would carry the guns and the equipment from the docks on the bay to this area for testing. Now let's move the camera to the left a little bit and you'll see the original firing range and the lighthouse off in the distance. Also, do you see the wooden planks which were connected together to be roads? Yeah, very primitive stuff. I mean, barely electricity. In this photograph, which is a different angle, you can see the observation tower. Now look at the fort, and you can also see the portals where the original cannons for the fort would have peeked out toward an approaching enemy, but cannons were never placed because the fort was never completed. And here's one of the guns, and you can still see that observation tower in the background. And here's our first look at one of the soldiers within the Army's Ordnance Department. These guys were brave souls, but you'll learn more about that later in our program. Now here's one of the guns being loaded with a projectile. Not only were the guns extremely heavy, but so were the bullets of the projectiles being used. They needed devices to carry them. Also, almost everything supporting the gun, under the gun, was made of wood. Concrete hadn't been invented yet, and when it is finally invented, everything here starts being made of concrete. And you see a lot of manual labor in these days. These guys had to work hard. Nothing was automatic in those days. And here's a great shot of one of the guns being tested. Now we're going to get into the details of the testing a little later in our program. In those days, big was always considered better. Great Britain had recently built an 81-ton gun, similarly converted to a rifle bore. And like the new U.S. 8-inch rifle, this was a muzzle-loading cannon. So the United States followed suit and started testing bigger guns to destroy the new ironclad vessels, which were being used toward the end of the Civil War and were now appearing in some European navies. It was also becoming clear that not only guns and barrels needed testing, but so did the carriages in which they sat when fired. And the Army needed to test these guns against the armor plates that would likely appear on the ships of our potential adversaries. Needless to say, activity at the Sandy Hook Proving Ground was hot and heavy beginning in 1875. In addition to government scientists and the Army's arsenals, the manufacturing facilities, a lot of private citizens, scientists, and manufacturers were beginning to participate in the development and testing of new weaponry as well. They were actually competing with each other in the quest for better weapons to defend our nation. So all kinds of guns, small and large, were being tested at the Sandy Hook Proving Ground. These included handguns and rifles, as well as machine guns and small field cannons, and of course the very large Seacoast most defense cannons. During the 1870s, supplies and gun parts in barrels were being shipped to Sandy Hook on a regular basis. The wharf, or the pier, which had been built in the late 1850s by the Corps of Engineers, was upgraded to handle all the shipments. Soon, both the Corps of Engineers and the Ordnance Corps were using the same pier. In 1876, a steam launch or boat was transferred to the Ordnance Department to facilitate transportation of government officials from New York City to Sandy Hook so they could view the tests or attend meetings or meet with manufacturers. Now, Congress was very concerned about the state of our defenses and fortifications, and directed by the President of the United States, it was to appoint a board on fortifications and other defenses. The board was appointed. The Secretary of War, William Endicott, delivered the report to Congress in January of 1886. The purpose of the board was to review and make recommendations for national defense based upon the weapons being developed and tested by the Ordnance Department. In 1891, Congress appropriated and President Grover Cleveland approved expenditures of money under the Congressional Act for Fortifications for tests of experimental guns and to build a narrow-gauge railway system from the proof battery to the targets in the firing range field. An 80-ton gantry crane was soon installed to move the heavy guns and barrels to the proof battery. By the end of that year, the personnel had increased to 45 ordnance soldiers, and the proving ground began to flourish once again. Some 6 miles of regular gauge railroad tracks were purchased, which would connect to New Jersey Central Railroad. A coal-fired locomotive was also purchased in 1884, and it was used daily. Also installed during 1884 was a powerful searchlight, which was mounted on a tower near the old masonry fort. So now we're going to move from this location by the fort to the final location of the proving ground before it moved to Aberdeen, with the same basic firing range going in the same general direction. And here's where the facility expands into something bigger. That's why we're breaking up this short tour into 2 areas, an administrative and maintenance area on the left and the proof battery where the weapons were tested on the right. And we're going to look at that one first. So this is it. Let's move it to the left of your screen and make it a little bit bigger. Now there are 3 basic components to the proof battery. There's the firing line where the guns are mounted and tested. There's the gun park, as they called it, adjacent to the firing line where they stored the guns waiting to be tested. And there was the firing range where the projectiles landed after being fired. So let's go to a great point of reference, the Sandy Hook Lighthouse, which many people have visited. There's where we're headed. So let's drive to the testing area. The lighthouse is on our left, and one of the bike paths is on our right. Now, we're about 5 minutes away from the location, so let's speed up a bit so we don't waste a lot of time. Now, we're headed east toward the Atlantic Ocean, but let's just stop here for a second. 9-gun battery is on the left, the ocean is straight ahead, and a parking lot is on our right. And here's the parking lot from a different angle. So let's go back, make a right turn, and head toward North Beach. But just before we do, we're going to turn left right here, and this is it. The bike path straight ahead goes right to the beach. To the right of the path is the proof battery where the guns were tested. And on the left side was the gun yard where guns, barrels, and explosives were stored. So here's where the guns were tested. This was the firing line, and the guns were aimed toward the right or to the south. And here's what it looked like back in the day. Here's another shot. And you see the artillery shells neatly stacked? And look at the lower part of the picture, and you'll see a set of tracks, like railroad tracks, except a lot wider. This was for a giant crane which would traverse the firing line to lift and carry guns and barrels from the gun yard to the firing line, or proof battery as it was called. And these big concrete structures were to protect folks from accidental explosions, which did occur from time to time, and unfortunately killed or injured a number of soldiers. Here's an opposite view looking west with the firing line on the left. And here's a close-up on the massive block of concrete used for protection. And you can probably see the tracks for the crane a little better here. Now take a look at this old photograph in which you can see the concrete structure as well as a building which was called the pressure house, which measured the pressure when a gun was fired. Across and on top of the 3 large concrete blocks was a walkway which went from one observation tower on the west side to another on the other side. And this thing is called a gun skid, and it was used to help move guns from one location to another, and it worked with the crane to do that. We're going to see more skids in a moment. And here in the foreground is the partial remains of that gun skid you saw on the photograph. And down here at the end is the remains of a 3rd large concrete bunker. But thank goodness they left a couple of the bunkers for us to see today. And here's a shot of the firing range and the bunkers, but let's zoom out to reveal the gun yard on the right. Here's another shot. Basically, the firing range is on the left side of the bike path, and the gun yard is on the right. And there used to be lots of buildings and equipment on the right side, but no more, except that large concrete structure was used to shelter a building which contained explosives. And look at New York City as it's seen from the proof battery. And there's the beach, except that the water, or the shoreline, was much closer to the proving ground at the turn of the century. A lot of sand is accumulated at the tip of Sandy Hook. These bolts were used to fasten down the guns on the firing line. Now we're looking back in the direction of the gun yard again, but panning over to the firing line and finally to the firing range where the projectiles were aimed. The lighthouse is off in the distance, but you can't really see it from our exact location. Some of the earliest forms of concrete were utilized here, and lots of the structures are beginning to show signs of age by cracking and crumbling. Here are the tracks again for the crane. Let's take a closer look at the area where the explosives were kept, and there were 2 buildings actually. This is the protective wall from one of them. And here's the other side where the foundation for the building is located. And here's a photo of the building in which you can see the protective wall on the outside. And here's the outside again today. Here's what's left of the brick wall of the structure itself. And again, the beach is over there. And over there is the protective wall for the second building, which also no longer remains. And here's what's inside of the second protective structure. And this, which is close to the firing line, is the base of an observation or fire control tower. Well, now we're looking at the firing line from the gun yard, and here are those gun skids which were located in the gun yard. Here's a close-up of one of them. And there was a bunch of gun skids located here, and this is one of them covered with bushes today. Do you see it? There are a couple of these gun skids still standing. There's the lighthouse where we started out our journey to get here. So that was basically the proof battery in the gun yard. Now let's just take a look at some of the guns, not all of them certainly, that were tested in those days. It's worth noting here that one of the biggest things ever tested here wasn't really a gun, it was a turret for a gun, and this one in particular. It was a turret designed by the Army for a large gun that would defend Fort Drum in Manila in the Philippines.
All of a sudden the Army gets looked at and says, guess what, dudes, you're gonna secure the best port in the Far East, Manila, because it's American now. So we start building forts. So a group of engineers get together and they decide, we're gonna take a small island, we're gonna cut it off to sea level, and we're gonna build up 30-foot thick concrete walls, and we're gonna put these big, huge Army turrets on them. Not Navy battleship turrets, but these are Army design. 2-gun, 14-inch turrets, 2 each turret weighed over 500 tons.
The turret wasn't tested at the regular firing line, but south of the proof battery, next to what today is a parking lot at one of the beaches. Now, let's visit the rest of the proving ground, the administrative, housing, and maintenance areas. And we're going to focus first on this place, which was kind of the headquarters, the main offices, and it had a flagpole, and a few things to make note of. You see those railroad tracks on the left? Well, they lead to the proof battery, which is behind us. The flagpole is in front of the main offices of the proving ground, and those brick buildings around the building with the smokestack are the maintenance and storage buildings, many of which stand today but as ruins. And obviously there were tents. They were tents all over, some used as quick field offices, while others were where some soldiers stayed if there wasn't room in the barracks. And today, here's where the headquarters building and the flagpole were generally located. Right there where those trees are standing. Here's a photograph of the building nicknamed Overhaul Park, and here are the guys who posed in front of the building who work inside. And here's Overhaul Park today. There was always a hubbub of activity in this general area. Carpenters, mechanics, engineers, welders, technicians of all kinds, scientists, private manufacturers, photographers, you name it. This was like a large factory and research facility. Some of these buildings are used today by the National Park Service. And after the Sandy Hook Proving Ground moved to Aberdeen, Maryland, the folks at Fort Hancock repurposed many of these buildings. There are lots of sidewalks leading nowhere, as well as foundations for buildings which no longer exist. This was a unique place when it was operational, and it wasn't part of Fort Hancock at all. In fact, most of the proving ground was off limits to personnel from Fort Hancock, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Let's take a few moments and look around this particular area, which is right outside of the entrance to the Coast Guard facility. Mother Nature appears to be reclaiming some of these buildings for herself. And over there is the officers' quarters for the Sandy Hook Proving Ground. Now, this particular area was conveniently located to Sandy Hook Bay, and so there was a wharf where equipment would arrive by boat or by train to be delivered either to one of the engineering or maintenance buildings or moved directly to the proving ground. And don't forget, there were train tracks all over the place, and all of them led to the roundhouse where the train engine was stored or maintained. There were also flatbed cars with guns on them, which would be pulled by the train. These guns could be moved to any location in the area, or in the country for that matter, which had railroad tracks and needed artillery for defense. This kind of strategic mobility was part of our defensive system throughout the United States. And here's the officers' quarters for the Proving Ground, which was later used as the Officers' Club of Fort Hancock after the Proving Ground left Sandy Hook. Here's the valet shed, which was built later and was used as part of the Officers' Club. And in the backyard was a barbecue area and a building to do laundry. For what it's worth, here's a peek inside the laundry building. Here's a panorama behind the officers' quarters of the general area here at the Proving Ground. There were also lots of other buildings, but they are long gone. That's Sandy Hook Bay over there, and that red brick building is the enlisted men's quarters, which later became a school for Fort Hancock, as well as the headquarters for coastal artillery. And here we are back behind officers' quarters. Oh, I like the way the sunlight is splashed on the outside of this building. Here's what the building used to look like, and here's some firemen trying to put a fire out when the building caught fire when it belonged to Fort Hancock. Obviously, many of these buildings are in disrepair, especially after Hurricane Sandy. But also, let's not forget, these buildings are very old. And in front of the officers' quarters were a couple of tennis courts. You can still see the high fence which surrounded the courts, but you can't see much else. And here's what the courts used to look like, and on the other side was a large vegetable garden. There was also a greenhouse nearby where flowers were grown, among other things. And near Sandy Hook Bay is a large T-shaped building which housed the enlisted men of the Proving Ground. In fact, it's the only T-shaped building in the area. And here are a few photographs of what it used to look like. And this building, located inside the Coast Guard property, is the chemical laboratory for the Proving Ground, in which scientists would formulate new mixtures for explosives, propellants, fuses, and the like. And look at this photograph, a classic taken by the photographer of the day by the name of Smedley. And do you see the chemical lab building, and then in the foreground and behind it a building called the Corral where the horses were kept? And there's the Masonry Fort, which is today on the property of the Coast Guard. And off in the distance is Fort Hancock with Officers' Row, as well as the lighthouse over on the left. And look at that train. There's so much to see in this photograph. The photographer is actually standing at the original location of the Proving Ground, which was next to the Masonry Fort before it moved a little to the southeast. Later, the building became another school for Fort Hancock. In fact, here's the sign for the school located over the door. Here's the site of the quarters of the master mechanic of the Proving Ground. And here's the proving ground foreman's house. And our last house on the tour belonged to the locomotive engineer, which had the biggest train set any kid could ever hope to have. So that is the administrative and maintenance tour of the Sandy Hook Proving Ground. Fort Hancock was eventually constructed. The Coast Artillery Corps would soon take responsibility for the peninsula and share the peninsula with the Ordnance Department's Proving Ground. By 1902, the Secretary of War ordered that a line of demarcation be drawn between the property of Fort Hancock and the property of Sandy Hook Proving Ground in recognition of its unique mission. And while they were separate and distinct, the Sandy Hook Proving Ground would still depend upon Fort Hancock for electricity, supplies, medical services, and many of the basic needs of the facility. The Sandy Hook Proving Ground became a standalone installation under the direct control of the Chief of Ordnance. The Chief of Coast Artillery would continue to support the Proving Ground logistically via Fort Hancock. The Sandy Hook Proving Ground needed more range, and Sandy Hook wasn't big enough. The testing missions also needed to be on a separate location from a defensive mission. As a result, in 1919, the Sandy Hook Proving Ground was closed, and the function of testing was moved to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland.
The most important thing for people to understand about the Sandy Hook Proving Ground, the Sandy Hook Military Reservation, which is the entire peninsula, is its impact upon America writ large. The development of rifled cannons, of seacoast cannons, the evolution of harbor defense, the evolution of air defense with the Nike program. To understand a lot of things that affect America across the board occurred in the Sandy Hook Proving Ground.
United States artillerymen roll out ammunition for the huge disappearing guns that are a part of America's elaborate coastal defense system. The charge is rammed home, and from the fire control tower, keen eyes spot the target. America speaks.
So far in our story of Sandy Hook, we don't have radar, computers, or sophisticated tracking equipment. We have our eyeballs. Binoculars, telescopes, slide rules, searchlights, and spotters and observation towers.
Fort Hancock itself was primarily manned by what were known as coast artillery troops, and then many support troops that would provide assistance to manning the armament, i.e. taking care of it, repairing it, making sure there was food, making sure the communication systems worked, maintain the vehicles that the troops used. So you had all these support troops, ordnance, quartermaster, Corps of Engineers that were supporting the coast artillery troops who manned the guns.
The routine of loading and aiming the gun would be practiced over and over again for speed, efficiency, and ultimately accuracy. The guns in the mortar battery became obsolete. However, the tunnel system inside the mortar battery was repurposed to become the command center for all of New York Harbor's defenses. Doesn't it look like a giant jigsaw puzzle? I see a piece and I wonder where it goes and how it fits and what did that thing do and what was that piece of rusted metal for? Battery Granger was also being constructed as a reinforced concrete 10-inch coastal gun battery. Battery Granger was completed in 1898 and deactivated in 1943. Battery Kingman and Battery Mills, constructed by 1919 as two 12-inch barbette gun batteries with two guns each, and they were initially in the open air, so to speak, and finally casemated or covered in 1942 when they became Fort Hancock's primary defense against naval attack in World War II. Whenever I do explore, I always discover something new, coming out of the ground or barely noticeable in the wooded area, or some new relic which provides me with another clue to the puzzle. And while they never really engaged in active combat here or any defensive firing of weapons, we should be grateful to them for being prepared to defend our country.